Hello there, kia ora. April 1st tends to be the time that we see changes from the government towards low-income people take effect. So that could be things like an increase in the minimum wage rate, or changes to working for family tax credits, or changes to beneficiary levels, and making sure that those benefit levels are switched up a little bit. And this year was no exception. What was different this year, though, was that the media coverage went from being, "this is how much better off beneficiaries are going to be," to, quote, "here's how much benefits, working for families increase." Very matter-of-factly, because most people understand the fact that under this particular government, beneficiaries and low-income earners are not going to be much better off, if at all, with these changes, with the possible exception of Luke Malpass from the Post, who actually said that these particular increases are, quote, "the spoonful of sugar to Nicola Willis's fiscal medicine." But at least that's kind of delusional, unlike somebody like David Seymour, whose cold, heartless response to minimum wage increases being so small was often they'll be students, often they'll be a partner who works part-time but has a full-time breadwinner elsewhere in the household, so I guess they don't count. Anyway, I thought it would be really interesting to have a look at some of these changes and how they can impact people and whether or not it's going to make a difference in the long run. And because there are so many changes and variables that come into play, I had to narrow it down a little bit. For example, this graph here is just the working for families tax credits that are available, and it's based on the number of people that you have in your household, children that you've got, the amount of money that you earn. There's a lot of interesting stuff that goes on there. So to narrow it down, I'm actually going to use some of the demographics from some of my social media sites to get an idea as to how best to frame this particular video. Now, these can't tell me whether or not somebody is single or in a relationship or have kids, but it can tell me an age breakdown and a location breakdown, and those are the ones that I'm using as my guide here. So let's take a quick look at these family tax credits. If you've got one child, for example, and you can't work, so you've got a relatively low income or on a benefit, you'd get an extra $8 a week, which isn't a huge amount, especially if your child is, say, under the age of 3. And depending on what your work circumstances are, you might be able to get a tax credit that goes those full 3 years. It's, like I said, a complicated mess, but $8 a week isn't a huge amount. Let's take nappies as an example. Disposable nappies at this time last year costed on average about 30 cents each. This year, they're 50 cents each. So over 2.5 years average that kids are wearing nappies, you'd be looking at about 6,000 of those that you'd go through. This time last year, that would have set you back $1,800. This year, that will set you back $3,000 for nappies. Or if you've got older kids, for example, and they need to catch a bus to school, the price increase on that for, say, secondary students in Auckland for one zone, so relatively close, is 65 cents. So it goes up to $1.35, which means in 10 trips per week, that's $6.50, which means per year for 40 weeks of the school year, that's $260 extra that you are paying. But you're still only getting $8 a week, so that leaves $1.50 per week extra, which is not ideal, clearly not ideal. Especially when you take a look at things like the cost of common items. Research that was done earlier this year used a common item marker, so rice, potatoes, tomatoes, fish, chicken, those kind of things. And that saw an increase in price per week of $28.16 for common household food items. That extra $1.50 you got from the bus difference clearly not making up much of a difference at all there. And when it comes to things like the minimum wage increase, that's a 45-cent increase an hour, which means on average, if you're working 40 hours a week, you're going to be getting an extra $18 a week, or $936 per year. But we also know that research released earlier this year showed that between last quarter and this current quarter, average rents in Auckland have gone up $30 per month, which is, if you can't tell, more than what you'd be getting on a minimum wage increase. In fact, there were increases almost across the entire country when it came to the price that people were paying for rent. On top of that, you've also got increases in costs for things like power, another amenity that you need to have. This year, we've been told the average increase is going to be just about $3 per week per household. And that still adds up to be quite a bit. Now, each of these changes are going to be different for each individual, of course, and you need to look into what it is that you're eligible for. There's different rates for couples and couples with kids and all that kind of stuff. But the general consensus is that the amount of money that people are getting extra to help who need it the most, because they're the lowest earning income earners, it's not going to cover the increasing costs that are being lumped upon us by a government who told us that they were going to focus on the cost of living crisis and then did things like hide tax reports. That kind of thinking doesn't help people. They tell us that they're going to take the regional fuel tax off fuel in Auckland, for example, but increase the amount that people have to pay for public transport, so it offsets that. All in all, when it comes to the way that people are going to be feeling at the end of this year, whether or not they've got a little bit extra in their hand or they're, breaking even, they're not going to feel like they're in a better position because they haven't had the help from the government, but the cost of everything else is quite clearly continuing to rise. And that's a real concern because it means that the poverty gap gets bigger. And while people argue that the minimum wage increase is designed to try and help increase productivity, people are less inclined to go out and work if they don't see some kind of reward for it, and treating your staff like they're disposable by only giving them tiny little pay rises, that's not a great way to increase that productivity. Overall, the way that this system is set up is really designed at the moment, the way the government is using it, to hold poor people down and keep them there and make sure people on lower incomes can't get into a position with a higher income, which is really, really a horrible way to run a country.